In the peak of the economic crisis, we had big magazines around the world publishing full-page articles, even covers saying we're all socialists now. You're saying essentially that idea is deeply flawed.
Well, I think it's a mistake. We could have possibly say we're all Keynesians now, except
Right.
maybe me. That's to say most governments responded to the crisis in the West with massive deficits of the sort that perhaps Keynes might have recommended. Though I think even Keynes would have been slightly stunned by a 14% of GDP deficit in his own home country, the United Kingdom. No, I don't think this is a triumph of socialism. Socialism is very much in the scrap heap of history. But it has been a big revival for Keynesian economics. And we'll see. I mean, the jury is still out. It seems to me most of the recovery we've seen so far, and it hasn't exactly been a roaring recovery in the West, has been due to monetary policy. It's been due to zero interest rates and quantitative easing by the Fed, by the European Central Bank, by the Bank of England. How far fiscal stimulus has really generated recovery, I think is a moot question. There are those, and I'm one of them, who doubt that this has been a particularly effective strategy. Keynes's theory was not meant to apply to a highly globalized world. It was meant to apply to relatively autarkic, closed economies. The United States is a very open economy, and most of the fiscal stimulus has the potential at least to leak out, for example, into demand for imports. So I'm not a Keynesian. I'm doubtful that the Keynesian policies that have been adopted have made a major contribution to recovery, and we may say this year that Keynesian policies have a downside, because if you explode your public debt up towards 100% of GDP, don't be surprised if it has a dampening effect on economic growth, because debt burdens slow things down.
Are there also inflationary pressures that we are continuously moving towards?
Well, I don't see inflation as the big worry this year. If anything, I think growth will surprise on the downside. We may actually see not deflation necessarily in the United States, but low inflation, lower than people are currently pricing in. I think although inflation is the ultimate destination of this train, it's not going to arrive in 2010. Historically, it's pretty clear. It's pretty clear that major explosions of public debt lead either to default or to inflation at some point. But it doesn't happen overnight. And debts can mount up over a period of years. They can have a depressing effect on growth as they do that. And it's only really quite late in the day. It may not be for another 5 or more years that you get a significant upturn in inflation. You know, the irony is that for many Americans, inflation would be great news. They have large debts that are denominated nominally in dollars. They need inflation if they but knew it. But it turns out to be quite hard to get to inflation in a deflationary world, in a world that the Chinese are still filling with underpriced goods.
The Newsweek, as of a couple of weeks ago, talks about how there is a whole new generation. There was a post-depression generation. There will perhaps be a post-recession generation. Is that hyperbole, or could that actually be true? Is there a post-recession generation that's coming out?
Well, unquestionably, in the sense that youth unemployment has really surged in the United States, and a significant number of people who have left college or high school in the last 2 years are out of work. And their prospects of getting jobs are pretty bleak right now. For those people, there's no question that this is a whole new and pretty unpleasant era. It's also the end of the age of leverage for the consumer. Let's face it, a very large part of the growth of the Bush years from 2001 onwards was based on consumer borrowing and the refinancing of mortgages. That game is over, and it can't resume because most households are now excessively in debt. So in two ways, I think, the world has changed. The Western world has changed. I think in the sense that unemployment is up and it's going to stay up, particularly for young people, and also in the sense that the game of borrowing your way to prosperity is clearly over.
Let me then come to the other big point that you consistently make. You call yourself an India bull, even more than a China bull.
I passionately believe you can't have sustainable development. You cannot have capitalism without the rule of law, private property rights, and representative government.
And that's not an apology for the empire.
Well, I'm happy to defend the legacy of empire because it wasn't by any means all bad.
That's right.
That's not to say that the empire was perfect. It committed many grave misdeeds, particularly in the time of the East India Company. But if one looks at India's transition in the 20th century towards democracy, one of the remarkable things is how many of the institutional legacies of empire are still with us today.
Including the language we speak in.
Including the language we're speaking in.
Yes.
Not to mention the way in which elite education works
Yes.
in this country.
Certainly.
And I think if you turn to India's future, the real question is, can India improve the educational standards at the bottom end of the social scale, raise them up to the very high standards that have been achieved by Indian institutions at the top end of the scale? If you do that, there's a huge potential upside for India. The human capital is there, but the educational quality isn't good enough. The thing that makes me an India bull is realizing how much unlocked potential there is in that sector of the population. And remember, the institutional framework is ultimately superior to the one the Chinese have. A planned economy, a one-party state, these things which are at the core of China's great boom will ultimately slow China down. It was the power of the Chinese state that led to the one-child policy. And the one-child policy is a demographic time bomb ticking away at the heart of the Chinese economic miracle. 20 years from now, the story is going to be very different. China will be slowing down, and I predict that the Indian tortoise will overtake the Chinese hare at some time in our lifetimes.
Is development, is the core idea of very fast rate development, China-esque development, if you will, is it inevitably arrogant?
It's much easier for dissent to be accommodated if you have a democratic system. And one of the striking features of India's democracy in the last 10 or 20 years has been the proliferation of new parties at the regional level representing the interests of hitherto excluded groups. In that sense, they have voice. They have a chance to articulate their grievances. In the absence of those institutions, in a country like China, the potential is much greater for an explosion. The losers in China, the people who lose their land to development, to new highways, do not have any voice, and they have to resort to violent protest. That seems to be a much less stable state of affairs. Now, that's not to make everything rosy in the Indian garden. There are clearly some serious problems that have to be addressed in India. The most obvious one that strikes the visitor is that India's infrastructure lags far behind China's. But there's a reason for that. It's not possible for the Indian government to build highways through villages the way that the Chinese can. And that's why, in the end, India is condemned to a slower growth rate than China in the next 10 or 20 years. But as I've said, the Chinese model ultimately runs into problems 10 or 20 years down the line. And at that point, it seems to me, we'll see the benefits of a democratic system with the rule of law and functioning private property rights. Even as the global balance of economic power shifts, and it's shifting very rapidly indeed. After all, think of it, China's GDP could be equal to that of the United States by 2027. That's not far away.
That's right.
Even as that is happening, the military balance of power in the world remains remarkably constant.